In the blazing heart of Texas, a proud rancher made a bold bet. No one could tame his wild black stallion, Midnight. One by one, the bravest riders tried and failed, leaving behind broken bones and shattered pride. But just as the legend seemed untouchable, a mysterious woman stepped into the ring, carrying only a harmonica, and what happened next would rewrite an entire legacy. By noon, the Texas hill country shimmered like a mirage, the live oaks casting coin-sized shadows that did little to soften the heat. Dust lifted from the paddock in lazy spirals, and the smell of sun-baked cedar mingled with leather oil and horse sweat. Henry Walker stood with his thumbs hooked in a cracked belt, hat brim pulled low enough to keep the glare from setting his eyes on fire. At 63, he wore his years like a brand, broad-shouldered, silver-stubbled, the kind of man whose word usually ended a conversation. Today, his words started one. "I'm telling you plain," he said, voice carrying over the rails to the ring of neighbors, ranch hands, and passing curiosity seekers. "No one's gonna ride that horse. Not now, not ever. And I'll put money on it." His palm thumped the rail for punctuation, a dry clap in the heat. The horse, a black-bodied storm named Midnight, pivoted at the far end of the corral, as if the sound were a spark. He was tall and hard-muscled, the blue sheen of his coat flaring where the light found him. His eyes, glossy and dark as mesquite coffee, cut toward the crowd the way a thunderhead sizes up a valley. He didn't stamp and flail like the broncs Henry had seen broken in his youth. He just watched, nostrils dilating, letting the air tell him where the threats were. $10,000, Henry called, and the murmur thickened. "You last 1 minute on his back, you take the cash and one of my best colts besides." 1 minute, he lifted a single finger as if he could pinch 60 seconds by the stem. Sheriff Cole Morales leaned on a fence post, his sunburnt knuckles pale on the grain. "Henry," he said, easy but edged, "you sure this is the road you want to ride down?" Henry didn't look over. Pride held his gaze like reins. "This is my road, Cole." Across the paddock, Tommy Hart, 19, boots too new, bravado still factory fresh, pushed through the line. "I'll give it a go," he said too loudly, drawing chuckles. "A minute's nothing." "Suit yourself," Henry said, not unkindly. He respected the boy's bite, if not his judgment. A ranch hand heaved open the gate, and the heat breathed out, bigger than before. Tommy climbed the rail, jaw tight, then dropped into the corral. Midnight wheeled, ears pricked, head high. The boy tried soft steps and soothing sounds he'd seen on television, palms out, hat low, like he could talk a storm into drizzling. The horse drifted sideways, light on his feet. 1 heartbeat, 2. And then the air broke. Tommy lunged. Midnight rose. Dust and light exploded together. It happened so fast, only the sound stitched it into memory. The whump of boots leaving dirt, the choked oof when breath punched out of Tommy's lungs, the hollow slap of his back against the ground. He rolled and scrambled with a stunned grin that said he'd planned to fall all along. The laughter was nervous relief, the kind neighbors spent quickly. "Next?" Henry opened his hands, inviting, as if he were hosting a church picnic instead of a dare. 2 more riders tried, before the heat began to bleed the edges off the day. A rodeo man with a champion's buckle lasted long enough to curse twice before Midnight's shoulder dipped and air turned treacherous beneath him. A woman from out near Kerrville, quiet and competent, didn't even make the mount. Midnight read the intent, and slid away like water. Henry kept his expression smooth, but every failed attempt polished something inside him. The feeling of being right. He'd bought Midnight at a sale that had smelled of rain and disappointment. The previous owner had said the horse just never took to folks, in the same tone some men said a river just never took to bridges. Henry had seen the look in the stallion's eye, distance coiled over distance, and wanted it, wanted the story of conquering it. That was the piece he wasn't saying aloud, not the money or the spectators or the sheriff's calm rebukes. It was the temptation to prove, one more time, that there wasn't a thing under the broad Texas sky he couldn't bend to fit his hand. Someone offered cold mint tea from a glass jar beaded with sweat. The crowd pressed closer, hats tilted, eyes narrowed against the light. Children wove through adult legs like minnows. Dogs panted in the shade. Tongues lolling, noses twitching when dust rose. The land itself seemed to wait, as if the scrub and stone might answer Henry if the people didn't. "Reckon we've proved our point," Cole said, not loud, to Henry. "He's got more fight than sense." "So, do you?" Henry's mouth twitched. "You read me like a wanted poster, Sheriff. Just saying the bet's turning into a spectacle." "That's the idea," Henry said, and there it was, naked in the sunlight. He gestured to his spread, the barns, the sea of pasture greening along the bottomlands, the house whose porch held the memory of his late wife's laughter. "Folks'll talk. The walkers raise horses even the best can't ride? You know what that does for breeding fees?" Cole's sigh was the sound of an old gate giving, not at the hinges, but in the hinge's idea of itself. "And what's it do for the part of you that used to love a horse for being a horse?" Henry didn't answer. He didn't have a clean answer to give. The afternoon tilted toward evening. Shade leaked from the oaks in long, dark rivers, and the metal troughs threw back the gold of the sinking sun. The paddock had gone quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. Midnight stood center ring, as if he had drawn the circle and was simply standing in the truth. Henry slapped dust from his jeans and raised his voice one more time. "Last call, 1 minute, 10 grand and a colt. Who's got the grit?" Silence took that dare and walked with it. Somewhere a hawk trailed the ridge, wing tilt precise, the way a craftsman turns a tool. Henry felt something small shift in his chest. Not doubt. He didn't allow himself the softness of that word, but an awareness that the day had set a hook in him too, and he didn't know what line it belonged to. A truck door creaked near the road. Heads turned. A woman stepped through the fence gap with the unhurried ease of someone who didn't owe the heat an apology. She wore scuffed boots, faded jeans, and a white shirt that had seen more soap than starch. Her hair was pulled back, dark as pecan bark, and a sun-browned harmonica case swung from a leather strap against her hip. She had the kind of face that made people guess she'd be kind, and then realize, a beat later, she'd be braver than that. "You takin' riders from out of town?" she asked, voice steady as a creek in drought. Henry blinked at her, surprised into a smile that didn't warm. "You a rider, ma'am?" "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I'm a listener." The crowd rippled with snorts and whispers, the sort of small meannesses people practice when they're unsure of themselves. Tommy, rubbing his shoulder, looked at her with a fragile, hungry interest. Cole tipped his hat. "Afternoon." "Grace Miller," she said, nodding to him, then to Henry. "I heard you had a horse nobody could sit." We've had ourselves a day proving that very thing, Henry said. He swept a hand toward the corral. You're welcome to add your name to the list. Grace's gaze slid past him and held on Midnight. Not defiant and not cowed, simply present. The horse shifted a single step, the way a man leans closer when he wants to catch a word. Grace's mouth softened, as if she'd heard it. I don't aim to ride him, she said, and the laughter started again, louder now that dusk gave folks permission to be bolder. I'd like to talk to him first. Henry's mirth thinned. He'd come up rough, learned to keep a skepticism that didn't flinch. Talkin's been tried, he said. Prayin' too. Then you won't mind if I try a song, Grace said, and her hand tapped the harmonica case as lightly as a calling card. The evening gathered itself. Heat bled off the earth. A ribbon of shadow laid itself across the paddock, and the scent of crushed sage floated up where boots had scuffed it. Henry felt the old stubbornness rise, habit masquerading as wisdom, and he nearly told her no. But he saw Cole watching him, and behind the sheriff the faces of his hands, and behind them the 100 small debts he owed to his land, and his dead, and his own legend. Pride wanted a refusal. Something else, some quiet, older than pride, wanted to see what would happen. 1 minute in the ring, he said at last, pointing toward Midnight. No one steps in for you. No one steps in for him. Grace nodded. Fair. She slipped the harmonica from its case, the metal dull with years and palms. Cole leaned near Henry. There's more than one kind of bet a man can lose, he said. Henry's jaw worked, or win. Grace climbed the rail, easy as breath, and dropped to the dust. Midnight watched her come the way a dark horizon watches lightning far off, the recognition of a language not yet spoken close. The crowd pressed forward, drawn by the oddity of a woman with music and no rope, a stranger not yet claimed by the story. The hush that fell wasn't reverent. It was full of appetite and fear, and the little hope that lives in people who want to see the world be bigger than they remembered it being. Henry's hands tightened on the top rail. All right then, he said, to no one, to everyone, to the evening itself. Let's see. The Texas night had given way to a pale morning, the kind where the horizon burned pink over the limestone ridges and the dew clung heavy to the blue stem grass. The crowd had thinned overnight, but was gathering again, word spreading from diner counters and church porches that something remarkable was brewing at Walker Ranch. By sunrise, wagons and pickups lined the dirt road, boots crunching gravel as neighbors and strangers alike filed in to see if Henry Walker's impossible bet would hold another day. Inside the paddock, Midnight moved like smoke with muscle. The stallion's coat caught the slanting light, black as wet obsidian, his mane trailing in unruly ribbons when he broke into a trot. He wasn't restless in the way most broncs were. He wasn't chewing boards or snapping his head in blind panic. Instead, his energy was measured, deliberate. Every twitch of an ear, every strike of a hoof carried the weight of intent. To watch him was to feel that he allowed the world to exist only because it amused him. The first rider of the day, a man called Rafe Dalton, had driven in from Abilene with a reputation for riding stock most men wouldn't climb a fence to look at. He strode in confident, hat cocked low, spurs gleaming. His friends hollered encouragement from the rail. Henry folded his arms and waited, his eyes narrowing against the light. Rafe took his time, circling, muttering in a tone meant to reassure. Midnight's head tracked him with slow disdain. When Rafe finally swung up, the air snapped tight. Midnight stiffened once, then launched skyward. The explosion sent Rafe pitching forward, his chin cracking the stallion's neck. A heartbeat later, he was airborne, limbs flailing. He struck the dirt with a grunt that pulled the wind from the crowd. Dust settled around him, while Midnight, untouched, landed clean and still, ears pinned in scorn. The rider limped, out, pride injured worse than bone. Henry didn't smirk, though victory hummed in his chest. His neighbor's whispers, half admiration, half unease, rolled like a tide he was learning to surf. Every failure was proof of his claim. Every rider who hobbled away was another nail in the legend being built here, a legend he owned. By mid-morning, another challenge came. A weathered rancher named Ellen Price, known for her stubborn streak as much as her cattle, climbed the rail. She was no rodeo queen, no hired hand chasing prize money. She was a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and kept her land afloat through droughts that broke stronger men. The crowd hushed in respect as she dropped to the dirt. Ellen moved with the slow patience of someone who had nothing left to prove. Midnight's ears flicked, his eyes narrowing, but she neither rushed nor reached. For a moment, it seemed he might tolerate her nearness. Then, as she lifted a hand toward his shoulder, he snapped his teeth with a ferocity that echoed like a gunshot. Gasps broke out as Ellen retreated, lips tight, dignity intact, but shaken. She left the corral with her back straight, not granting the horse the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. The failure weighed differently. Some in the crowd shook their heads, muttering that no human pride could stand against that much fire. Others leaned closer, eager for the next disaster. The spectacle was feeding itself. Henry stood apart, arms behind his back, feeling both the pride of being proven right and a flicker of something more dangerous. The knowledge that each defeat was hardening Midnight's legend into unbreakable stone. By noon, the heat rose like steam from the earth. The air carried a tang of sweat, mesquite smoke from makeshift grills, and the sharp metallic scent of tension. Sheriff Cole returned, his uniform shirt damp, hat pulled low. He leaned near Henry, speaking low so only he could hear. "You're making this horse into more than flesh and blood. Folks are starting to see a ghost story standing there." Henry's jaw worked. "Ghost stories sell colts." "Ghost stories eat men alive," Cole said, eyes on Midnight. "Mark me." Before Henry could answer, the stallion reared suddenly, slamming his forehoofs against the corral rails. The wood shuddered, a splinter snapping and flying into the dirt. Children squealed, mothers pulled them back. Midnight landed heavy, breathing hard, muscles slick with light. He swung his head toward the crowd, nostrils flaring, and a ripple of unease moved through the people like wind through prairie grass. Henry's son, Caleb, broad-shouldered but softer in gaze, came from the barn with a canteen. He pressed it into his father's hand, his voice tense. "You're pushing this too far. Look at him. He ain't just angry, he's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Henry asked. Caleb hesitated. "For someone different." The remark sat between them like a live coal burning, without flame. Henry drank from the canteen and said nothing. The day bled on. More attempts, each faster, each crueler in failure. A rodeo clown trying to distract Midnight earned a swift kick to the fence that left the boards cracked, and the man shaken pale. A wiry drifter, who claimed he'd never met a bronc meaner than him, staggered out with his shirt torn open and a bruise flowering across his ribs. By the time shadows lengthened again, midnight stood calm and untouchable, a black pillar against the gold sky. He hadn't been ridden, not even for seconds. No hand had bridled him, no rope had tamed his stride. He was still the storm no one could catch, the shadow that made Henry's wager swell with power. But beneath Henry's pride, something else churned. The faintest thread of unease, thin as barbed wire, whispering that perhaps Midnight's defiance wasn't meant to crown the Walker name, but to unravel it. And when the evening cooled and the crowd began to drift toward their trucks, a rumor spread low and quiet. A stranger was in town, a woman carrying nothing but a harmonica and a reputation for listening where others shouted. Some laughed. Others leaned in, hungry for novelty. Henry heard it too, and though he barked at his men to settle the gates and clear the dust, his eyes strayed toward the road, as if he half expected the rumor to step out of the twilight and meet him head on. The third day of the wager dawned heavy with clouds, the kind that threatened rain, but rarely delivered in the hill country. The earth smelled of dust and anticipation, a mixture that clung to every breath. By now, the Walker Ranch was no longer just a pasture with a challenge. It was a destination. Men and women drove from towns 2 counties away. Children balanced on fence rails, and old-timers traded bills as if they were buying futures. Henry Walker's gamble had become something larger than himself, and he reveled in it even as it unsettled him. Midnight stood in the corral like a monument carved from stormlight. His coat was still black and gleaming, though streaked with dust from the riders who had tried and failed. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, fixed on each new challenger, as though he measured them against some private standard. By now, more than a dozen attempts had been made. Not one had lasted more than seconds. The failures piled up like driftwood against a riverbank, and with each one, Henry's pride swelled, even as the unease in his chest deepened. The morning's first contender was a broad-shouldered rodeo rider named Clint Parsons, whose belt buckle shone almost as brightly as his reputation. Clint swaggered through the gate, confident enough to wink at the crowd. He took a breath, launched himself onto Midnight's back, and for 2 heartbeats, he almost looked in control. Then Midnight spun sideways, a motion too sudden to predict, and Clint's body whipped through the air before slamming into the dirt with a sound that made the spectators wince. When he rose, coughing dust, his swagger was gone, replaced with the stunned look of a man who had touched something beyond his skill. The next was a quiet hand from a neighboring ranch, a boy named Jesse, who carried himself like he belonged around horses. He didn't charge, didn't try to outmuscle the stallion. Instead, he approached softly, whispering words no one could hear. For a moment, hope flickered. Midnight lowered his head, as if listening. Then, in a single heartbeat, the stallion lunged, teeth snapping inches from Jesse's arm. The boy stumbled back, eyes wide with shock, before scrambling to safety. The crowd exhaled in a rush, half disappointed, half relieved. By midday, Henry's office in the ranch house had become a revolving door of visitors. Breeders wanted to buy rights to Midnight's bloodline. Journalists wanted quotes for their stories. Betting men wanted to raise the stakes, each certain that sooner or later someone would succeed. Henry poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid trembling slightly in his hand. He studied the photographs on his wall, rows of sleek horses he had bred, trophies from fairs and competitions. They had once been proof of his life's work. Now they seemed small, overshadowed by the shadow in the corral. Sheriff Cole appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his expression carved from disapproval. "Henry, you're making a circus out of something sacred. Horses ain't meant to be sideshow tricks." Henry swirled the whiskey, eyes hard. "This is business, Cole. This horse is the future of Walker Ranch. Folks will remember his name long after they forget ours." "And what good's that?" Cole asked softly. "When your name's tied to bruises and broken bones?" Henry turned back to the window. Midnight was standing still, ears pricked, head lifted as though he could hear the whispers traveling through the ranch. The horse looked less like a beast to be conquered and more like a riddle to be solved. One Henry was determined to answer on his own terms. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, another rider stepped forward. This one was different. Javier Cruz was no young cowboy or flashy showman. He was an older man, silver hair curling under his hat, with a face lined by both laughter and sorrow. He had spent a lifetime breaking wild mustangs in New Mexico, and he carried himself with the slow confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The corral went silent as Javier entered. Even Midnight seemed to pause, ears swiveling toward the man. For long minutes, Javier did nothing but stand there, hands loose, eyes steady. He let the stallion circle him, snort, paw the dirt. When he finally reached out, it was gentle, measured. His palm hovered just inches from Midnight's muzzle. The stallion's breath fogged the space between them, hot and sharp. Hope swelled in the crowd like a rising wind. But Midnight's trust, if it had ever existed, vanished in a flash. With a sudden twist, the stallion surged sideways, his body a blur of power. Javier was sent sprawling, his hat rolling into the dirt. The old man pushed himself up slowly, dignity intact, but shoulders heavy with defeat. "He don't want a rider," he muttered, brushing the dust from his knees. "He wants something else." The words carried farther than he intended. They settled in the ears of the crowd, in Cole's thoughtful gaze, in Caleb's quiet frown, and in Henry's heart, where they sparked something sharp and defensive. He clenched his jaw, refusing to believe. For Henry, to admit the horse was untamable was to admit that control was an illusion, that all his years of building this ranch had been built on sand. As twilight gathered, the crowd dispersed more slowly than before, conversations buzzing with both awe and uncertainty. Some claimed Midnight was cursed. Others swore the right rider simply hadn't come along. Henry stood by the fence, staring into the dark eyes of the stallion that had undone so many proud men and women. Midnight stared back, unblinking, as though challenging him not just to try again, but to understand. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the chorus of crickets and the sigh of the wind, Henry heard his own pride whispering, "You cannot lose." By the fourth day, the Walker Ranch was no longer just a ranch. It had become an event. Dusty roads that usually only knew the weight of feed trucks and cattle trailers were now jammed with wagons, pickups, and shiny cars from Dallas and San Antonio. Local boys in boots leaned against fence posts, while city folk in pressed shirts wandered the pastures with wide eyes, as if they'd stepped into some living legend. The air smelled of fried dough, smoked brisket, and hot horses, the scents twining together like the voices of the crowd that grew louder with every hour. Henry stood on the porch of his big white house, surveying the spectacle with a mixture of pride and unease. The front yard, once a quiet patch of lawn where his late wife had grown roses, was now littered with vendor stalls selling beer, chili, and hand-stitched hats. Kids darted past, laughing as they chased each other with sticks, while men traded money and shouted odds on how long the next fool might last on Midnight's back. The bet he had thrown down in a moment of defiance had turned into a wildfire, and the whole county was feeding it. Midnight, for his part, seemed to thrive in the chaos. In the center corral, he circled with restless grace, hooves kicking up golden dust that hung in the sunlight like smoke. His ears flicked constantly, nostrils wide as he drank in the smell of grilled meat and human sweat. He was no longer just a horse. He was a spectacle, a myth in motion, and the crowd roared with anticipation every time he bucked at a shadow or reared against the rails. Tommy Hart, his shoulder still stiff from his fall 2 days earlier, limped among the vendors with a sheepish grin plastered on his face. He had become something of a local celebrity, the boy who had dared and failed. Kids asked him what it felt like to fly, and he told them with mock bravado that it was like ridin' lightning without the rain. His pride was bruised, but there was a spark in his eyes that said he wasn't done with Midnight. Not yet. Sheriff Cole moved through the crowd with a frown deepening under his hat brim. He stopped beside Henry and gestured toward the corral where men were piling up betting slips like kindling. "This is out of hand," he said. "You got 500 people here, maybe more. Someone's gonna get hurt bad if this keeps up." Henry's jaw tightened. "They came of their own will. Nobody dragged them here. They came because you promised a show," Cole countered. "You turned a horse into a headline." Henry looked away, toward Midnight, who had just thrown a violent kick at the rail, scattering dust onto the front row. The crowd erupted in cheers as if they'd witnessed a prizefighter land a punch. "And look at them," Henry said, his voice grim. "They can't get enough." Inside the corral, a fresh challenger was preparing. Frankie Miller, a drifter with scars along his jawline and a reputation for reckless stunts, swaggered into the ring. He tipped his hat to the ladies in the front row, then spat in the dirt and pulled his gloves tight. The announcer, a local ranch hand Henry had hired to keep the crowd entertained, bellowed his name, and the people hollered back, stamping their boots on the wooden bleachers. Frankie tried a trick none had dared yet. Instead of climbing aboard quickly, he cracked a whip near Midnight's hooves, thinking to startle him into submission. The stallion reacted like a storm breaking. He bolted sideways, teeth snapping, and slammed Frankie against the fence before anyone could blink. The man crumpled, wheezing, his hat rolling across the dust. He was dragged out by 2 others, half-conscious, while the crowd's roar turned uneasy. Henry felt the eyes of the sheriff burning into him. "It's not entertainment anymore, Henry," Cole said quietly. "It's blood sport." But the money kept flowing. The people kept coming. And Henry's pride refused to bend. Late in the afternoon, as the sun slid low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, Caleb appeared at his father's side. His voice was low, urgent. "Pa, this isn't what Ma would have wanted. You know that. Look at the corral. It's a carnival now, not a ranch." Henry's throat tightened, but he didn't answer. He only watched Midnight, who had come to a stop in the center of the corral, head lifted, ears pricked. The stallion looked out over the crowd with an air of challenge, as though he understood the role they had written for him and embraced it. He was not broken, not defeated. He was waiting. The crowd began to chant, a low rhythmic call that rose with the heat. "Midnight, midnight, midnight!" The sound rolled over the ranch like thunder, echoing into the hills. For the first time, Henry felt a twinge of fear, Not for the horse, not for the riders, but for the part of himself that had created this. He had wanted a reputation. What he had birthed instead was a frenzy. And as the chant grew louder, word spread again, whispered on the breeze, carried from mouth to mouth, that a stranger was coming. Not a cowboy, not a drifter, not a gambler, a woman, they said, who carried music in her pocket instead of rope, and who claimed she could reach where others had failed. Henry clenched his fists as the crowd leaned into the rumor. He didn't believe it, not for a moment. But in the pit of his stomach, unease coiled tighter, because he knew, deep down, that legends weren't broken by more of the same. They were undone by something no one expected. By the time the 5th day broke, the Walker Ranch looked less like a homestead and more like a fairground. Canvas tents lined the fences, smoke from barbecue pits curled into the sky, and the sound of fiddles mixed with the hum of hundreds of voices. Reporters from Austin and Dallas had arrived, notebooks tucked under their arms, eager to scribble down the latest failure at Henry Walker's bet. Men shuffled bills in their hands, bookies barked odds, and children waved paper flags with "Midnight" scrawled across them in bold black ink. The stallion had become larger than life, and Henry could feel the world closing in around his pride. Midday heat shimmered off the corrals when the first whisper spread. A woman had come. Not a ranch hand, not a rodeo rider, not one of the roughnecks who usually volunteered for glory. A stranger. She was spotted first at the far end of the dirt road, walking with a steady gait that didn't falter even under the relentless sun. By the time she reached the main corral, the crowd had quieted to a hush, as though the air itself held its breath. Grace Miller. The name was passed from mouth to mouth, uncertain at first, then louder, like a drumbeat building. She wore simple jeans and a linen shirt rolled at the sleeves, scuffed boots that had seen miles of road, and a small leather satchel slung across her body. Her dark hair was braided neatly, though wisps had broken free to frame her sun-browned face. She didn't strut or smile for the audience. Her green eyes scanned the corral, settling on the black stallion within, as if no one else existed. The laughter began almost immediately. "She's lost her way to the schoolhouse," someone shouted. "A lady teacher's gonna break that demon?" Another jeered. Henry felt a smirk tug at his mouth despite himself, though the sheriff shot him a look sharp as a spur. Grace stopped at the gate, her hands light on the rail. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice calm but clear enough to carry. "I've heard about your wager. I'd like to step in." The crowd erupted, in disbelief. Some clapped their knees in amusement, others whistled, the noise rolling like thunder. Henry raised a hand, and silence fell reluctantly. "Ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing charm. "5 of the best riders in this state have gone down in the dirt. I can't have a schoolmarm breaking her neck on my land." Grace's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "I didn't come to ride him." She tapped the satchel at her side. "I came to listen." The words stilled the crowd, if only for a heartbeat. Then came the scoffs, the ridicule louder than before. A man shouted from the back, "He don't need no lullaby, lady." But the sheriff was watching her with narrowed eyes, as though he recognized something the others didn't. Caleb, standing near his father, felt his pulse quicken. There was something in the way she held herself, quiet, steady, fearless, that told him she wasn't here for spectacle. Henry chuckled, though it rang hollow. "You can stand in that ring if you like, but don't expect my men to haul you out when he turns." He gestured toward Midnight, who stood with his head high, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. The stallion hadn't looked at anyone like that before. Not with curiosity instead of fury. Grace nodded once. Fair enough. She slipped the satchel from her shoulder, unbuckled it, and drew out a worn harmonica, its silver dulled by years of use. She rubbed a thumb across the metal, as though greeting an old friend. Then, without another word, she climbed the rail and dropped lightly into the dust. The corral had never been so silent. Even the children hushed, sensing something different in the air. Grace didn't march toward Midnight, nor did she reach for him. She began walking slowly in a wide circle, her boots kicking up little puffs of dirt. The harmonica lifted to her lips, and a low, haunting note drifted out. Thin at first, then swelling with a sweetness that wrapped around the crowd like smoke. Midnight froze. His ears flicked, his head tilted, and for the first time since Henry had bought him, he didn't lash out. He simply listened. The music wound through the hot air, carrying echoes of prairie winds and creek water, something older than words. The crowd shifted, unsure whether to laugh or to watch. Tommy Hart leaned forward on the fence, his mouth hanging open. "She's got him listening," he whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. Henry's throat went dry. He had expected this stranger to be trampled, to prove his point once more. Instead, Midnight's muscles eased, his tail swishing lazily instead of lashing. The stallion's eyes, once hard and wild, softened, fixed on the woman with the harmonica. Sheriff Cole muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be damned." Grace didn't look at the crowd, didn't even glance at Henry. Her focus never wavered from Midnight. She lowered the harmonica after a final, lingering note and extended a hand, palm open. Empty. The stallion snorted once, pawed the dirt, then took a single step toward her. Gasps rippled through the stands. The legend of Midnight had been built on defiance, on broken riders and shattered pride. Now, before the eyes of hundreds, the stallion was moving not in anger, but in choice. Henry felt his chest tighten, his pride warring with an unfamiliar sensation. Fear. Not fear of the horse, but of what this woman might reveal. Not about Midnight, but about himself. The crowd leaned forward as Grace's hand hovered inches from the stallion's muzzle. Dust hung in the air, the world balanced on the edge of something no one had dared imagine. And in that fragile silence, Henry realized with a jolt that his wager was no longer his. It belonged to the stranger, the stallion, and the song that had turned the air into something holy. The air inside the corral was different now, weighted not with dust and sweat, but with something harder to name. Grace Miller stood still, harmonica lowered, her palm extended like an offering. The stallion had not struck, had not bucked, had not reared. Midnight, the horse who had flung seasoned riders into the dirt, was watching her with the sharp eyes of a creature trying to remember a dream. The crowd dared not breathe too loudly, afraid that sound alone might break whatever thread tied the two together. Midnight pawed once at the dirt, a half measure between aggression and invitation. Grace didn't flinch. She simply took another step, slow as the swing of a porch rocker. Her boots whispered against the packed soil. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice carrying no command, only cadence. The words weren't meant for the crowd, but the silence carried them across the bleachers. Henry Walker leaned against the top rail, his heart pounding against the cage of his chest. He had seen Midnight savage every man who dared enter that pen. He had bet his name, his money, his reputation on the horse being unrideable. Now, against reason, he felt a tide pulling against his certainty. His fingers dug into the rough wood as if he could anchor himself. The sheriff's voice cut low beside him. "That horse is listening." "I've never seen him listen." Henry clenched his jaw. "Listening ain't ridin'." Grace shifted her weight, circling slowly rather than advancing straight. Midnight tracked her, muscles tight beneath his dark coat. Then she lifted the harmonica again, a single note spilling out, trembling and soft, like wind caught between canyon walls. The stallion's ears pricked forward, his breathing steadied. The sound wrapped around him, not forcing, not commanding, but weaving through his restlessness like threads of calm. Tommy Hart, perched on the rail despite his bruised ribs, whispered in awe. "She's talking to him without saying a word." The stallion lowered his head an inch. It was nothing, a gesture smaller than dust settling, but to the watchers it was as if the earth itself had shifted. A murmur rippled across the crowd, half prayer, half disbelief. Grace stopped within a few feet of Midnight, still spiraling, still patient. She lifted her hand again, this time closer. Her palm hovered in the charged air between them. Midnight flared his nostrils, the hot rush of breath brushing her skin. He could have snapped his teeth, lashed out with hooves, ended the fragile moment. Instead, he lingered, caught in a current the crowd could neither see nor understand. Henry felt sweat trickle down his back, though the evening breeze had cooled. The sight knifed through him, his untamable horse, the living embodiment of his wager, standing quiet before a woman who had no rope, no spur, no whip. The crowd erupted suddenly when Midnight stepped forward and touched her hand with the soft weight of his muzzle. The sound was not cheers at first, but gasps, a collective intake of breath that broke into wild applause. Hats flew into the air. Men hollered. Women clasped their hands to their mouths. But Grace didn't turn to them. Her eyes stayed on Midnight. She stroked the bridge of his nose with the gentlest touch, as if afraid he might vanish like mist if pressed too hard. "There you are," she whispered, and the stallion closed his eyes for one long blink, the kind of gesture horses reserved for trust. Henry swore under his breath. The bet was unraveling before him, not in the failure of men, but in the triumph of something else entirely. Pride told him to step into the ring, to pull her out before his legend crumbled. But he couldn't move. His boots might as well have been nailed to the earth. The sheriff glanced at him, eyes sharp with unspoken words. Caleb, Henry's son, leaned forward from the crowd, wonder etched into his young face. For once, Henry didn't meet his gaze. He couldn't. Grace lowered the harmonica once more, slipping it into her pocket. Her hand slid to Midnight's cheek, and the stallion leaned into it as though it had been what he wanted all along. Around them, the world blurred. Shouts, clapping, stamping boots, the metallic ring of spurs on wood. But inside the circle of the corral there was only a woman, a horse, and the hush of something breaking open. Then, without warning, Midnight reared. His hooves slashed the air, his muscles heaved, dust exploded around them. The crowd screamed. But Grace didn't retreat. She held her ground, eyes lifted to meet the shadow above her. The stallion hovered in the violent balance between fury and surrender, then came down with a thud that rattled the boards. His head lowered, his chest heaving, but his ears stayed forward, listening. Grace reached again, steady, certain. Midnight pressed his muzzle to her shoulder, the gesture unmistakable. The corral erupted again, this time in wild disbelief. Tommy shouted, his voice hoarse with excitement. "She's got him! She's got him!" Henry's pride roared in, his blood, but beneath it was something colder, the dawning realization that the story was slipping from his hands. Midnight was no longer his beast of defiance. He was becoming her proof, her miracle. As the last of the daylight bled into a lavender dusk, Grace leaned close and whispered into the stallion's ear words no one else could hear. Midnight shifted, his body easing, and for the first time since he had set hoof on Walker land, he stood utterly still. Not conquered, not broken, simply understood. The evening light slipped into a softer gold, casting long shadows across the Walker ranch. Dust still hovered in the air where midnight had reared and landed, but the corral now pulsed with something no one had expected. Silence charged with awe. Grace Miller stood with her hand resting lightly against the stallion's cheek, her fingers moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The wild creature who had humiliated every rider before her leaned into her touch, as though it were a comfort he had been waiting for. The crowd erupted in waves, applause, whistles, and shouts that rose like a storm, but Grace didn't acknowledge them. She remained inside that quiet circle she had carved with midnight, ignoring the people pressed against the rails. Her green eyes stayed locked on the stallions, steady and unflinching, as if she and the animal were carrying on a conversation no one else could hear. Henry Walker's mouth was dry as chalk. He gripped the fence so hard the wood bit into his palms. This wasn't supposed to happen. Midnight was meant to defy every human hand, to prove Henry's wager unshakable. Instead, the stallion had chosen to yield. Not to him, not to his seasoned riders, but to a woman with nothing but patience and a song. "Good Lord," murmured Sheriff Cole, shaking his head. "He trusts her." Henry bristled at the words. Trust wasn't the point. Control was. And he knew, deep in his bones, that if Midnight could be gentled by her, the story of his ranch would no longer belong to him. Grace shifted slightly, running her hand along the stallion's jaw. Midnight exhaled with a long, slow breath, warm against her arm. Then, in a movement so natural it seemed preordained, he lowered his head into her open palm. Gasps rippled across the stands. Some spectators began weeping openly, struck by the beauty of the moment. Caleb, Henry's son, leaned forward, his eyes shining. "Pa," he whispered, not caring if his father heard. "That's what I've been saying." He didn't need another rider. He needed someone who would listen. Henry didn't respond. His throat tightened around words he couldn't form. The corral felt transformed. The crowd's noise softened, replaced by an almost reverent hush. Grace spoke again, her voice low but clear enough to carry. "You're not wild, Midnight. You're waiting." Her words brushed through the air like wind through prairie grass. The stallion's ears flicked forward, listening. And then it happened. With a fluid grace, Grace stepped closer until her shoulder brushed Midnight's muzzle. The stallion leaned in, resting the heavy weight of his head against her. The corral fell utterly silent. In that moment, the line between beast and human blurred. He was not conquered, not broken, but connected. The crowd's restraint shattered. A roar of disbelief and celebration surged, boots stomping on wooden bleachers, hats thrown skyward. People shouted her name, even though most had only just learned it. "Grace! Grace! Grace!" The chant rolled across the ranch like thunder. But not all were celebrating. Henry's pride throbbed like an old wound reopened. He wanted to believe this was a trick, some coincidence, a fluke that would vanish as quickly as it came. Yet the sight in front of him left no room for denial. Midnight had chosen her. Grace gently stroked the stallion's neck, then lifted her harmonica once more. She played a new tune, softer, slower, tender as a lullaby carried by the evening wind. Midnight's eyelids drooped, his ears relaxed, and he stood still, utterly calm. For the first time since he had set foot on Walkerland, the black stallion looked peaceful. Tommy Hart, still nursing his bruises, stared wide-eyed from the rail. "She did what none of us could." She made him want to stay. Henry's pride screamed inside him, but the crowd's cheers drowned it out. He turned away for a moment, staring at the horizon where the sun was bleeding into purple dusk. Something twisted in his chest. Something that felt dangerously like surrender. Grace ended her song with a final lingering note, then lowered the harmonica. She pressed her forehead gently to Midnight's, closing her eyes. The stallion stood rooted, breathing slow and steady, as though he had finally found a place to rest. And in that fragile stillness, the world seemed to pause, balanced on the edge of something vast. Henry Walker's bet had begun as a boast. Now, in front of hundreds of witnesses, it was becoming a story of revelation, and Henry, once its author, was being written out by the quiet touch of a stranger's hand. The ranch was electric. What had begun as disbelief was now a fever coursing through the crowd. They stamped their boots, slapped the rails, and shouted Grace's name as though she were some outlaw hero pulled from a ballad. Midnight stood still under her hand, his black coat shimmering in the torchlight now scattered around the corral. His nostrils flared, but not with anger. There was a strange steadiness in his breathing, like a storm that had finally found its rhythm. Grace lifted her eyes to meet the stallion's. "It's all right," she whispered, words that seemed to sink into the air itself. Then, with a movement so fluid it shocked even her, she pressed both hands against Midnight's neck and vaulted onto his back. The corral exploded. Screams of awe, gasps of terror, wild applause all merged into a thunder that shook the night. For a breathless second, no one moved. Then Midnight did. His muscles bunched, his back arched, and Henry's heart seized. He expected the stallion to erupt, to fling her into the dirt like every rider before. But the eruption never came. Midnight stood tall, adjusting to the new weight as though it belonged. His head flicked once, tail swished, and then he stepped forward, carrying Grace across the corral with a smoothness no one had ever seen in him. The crowd's roar turned into stunned silence. Even the children, who had been cheering wildly, froze in awe. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic thud of Midnight's hooves against the packed soil. Grace leaned low over his neck, her hands steady, her body moving in sync with his stride, as though she had been born in that saddleless seat. Henry Walker felt his knees weaken. He had built his life around the belief that every creature could be conquered by will, by strength, by sheer determination. And yet here was Midnight, the horse who had broken bones and humbled men, trotting gently under a woman who had asked nothing of him, except to be understood. Sheriff Cole muttered. I'll be damned. He's carrying her like she was always meant to be there. Tommy Hart's eyes shone with tears he didn't bother to hide. It ain't riding, not the way we think of it, he whispered. It's like they're the same. Grace guided Midnight in a wide circle, her body language subtle, her voice low, humming the same tune she had played on the harmonica. Midnight followed without resistance, his ears flicking back toward her voice, his steps measured and calm. He passed by the rail where Henry stood frozen, and for the briefest moment, the stallion's eyes flicked toward his owner, not with rage, not with fear, but with something like judgment. Henry turned away, unable to hold the gaze. The chant had shifted now, not just her name, but his. Midnight! Midnight! The people had stopped seeing him as a beast to conquer. He was something more, something sacred. And Grace had unlocked it. The final test came when she slowed him to a stop in the center of the corral. She pressed her lips near his ear, whispering something only he could hear. Then, with a light touch of her heels, she urged him forward into a trot once more. Midnight obeyed instantly, moving as though he had been trained for years. The crowd erupted again, louder than before, stamping, clapping, screaming themselves hoarse. Some leapt onto the rails, others threw hats into the air, but no one could look away. Grace sat tall, the picture of serenity, guiding Midnight back to the very gate where it had all begun. She dismounted with the same fluid grace, sliding down his side and landing softly in the dust. Midnight remained beside her, lowering his head as if to nuzzle her shoulder. For a long moment, there was nothing but awe. Then Sheriff Cole raised his hat, voice cutting above the din. Folks, you've just seen history made. Henry Walker's chest felt hollow. He had wanted spectacle, and he had gotten it. But it was not the kind he had dreamed of. His legend, his wager, his control, every bit of it had slipped into the hands of a woman with a harmonica and the courage to see the stallion as more than an enemy. Grace looked toward him at last, her expression calm but firm. He was never indomitable, Mr. Walker, she said clearly enough for all to hear. He was just misunderstood. The words fell like a gavel in a courtroom. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing across the hills. Midnight pressed his muzzle to Grace's shoulder again, and she stroked his mane as if sealing a promise. Henry's pride cracked like old timber, but beneath it was something unexpected, an ache that felt like the first stirrings of humility. Night had fallen heavy over the Walker Ranch, but the corral still glowed under lanterns and torches. The crowd lingered, buzzing with the kind of energy that could not be carried home, as though leaving would risk waking from a dream. Midnight stood calmly at Grace Miller's side, the black stallion transformed before their eyes from a demon to a companion. The chants had faded, but the memory of them still pulsed in Henry Walker's ears. Henry remained at the rail, his hands gripping the wood until his knuckles whitened. All day he had been the master of this story, the man daring others to try and fail. But now, with his horse standing docile under a stranger's hand, he felt like an intruder in his own tale. The crowd's admiration no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, irresistibly, toward Grace and Midnight. Sheriff Cole stepped closer, his voice pitched low but sharp. You see it now, don't you? He never needed to be broken. He needed to be heard. Henry's throat tightened. That ain't ridin', he muttered, but his voice cracked, betraying the weakness beneath the words. Cole's gaze was steady. You're right. It ain't riding. It's something bigger. Caleb moved through the crowd, his eyes glowing with awe. He reached the fence and looked at his father. Pa, do you see? He trusts her. He never trusted any of us. Henry felt the burn of shame creep up his neck. His son's words cut deeper than Cole's. For years, he had taught Caleb that strength, control, and discipline were the only way to survive in ranching, in life. Now, in front of half the county, that lesson had unraveled in the shape of a woman's hand resting on a stallion's neck. Grace lifted her eyes from Midnight and looked directly at Henry. There was no triumph in her gaze, no pride at his humiliation. Only calm, unwavering truth. He's not against you, Mr. Walker, she said, but he'll never bow to force. The crowd hushed again. Every ear strained for Henry's reply. His pride warred with the weight in his chest, a battle so loud he could hear nothing else. At last, with boots heavy as stone, Henry unlatched the gate and stepped into the corral. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some thought he might snatch the horse away, reclaim his dominance with harshness. Others feared Midnight would lash out and trample him. But Henry kept walking, each step slower than the last, his breath loud in his ears. Midnight turned his head toward him, ears pricked, eyes dark as the sky. Henry stopped a few feet away, heart hammering. He hates me, he said, his voice raw. Grace shook her head. No, he remembers what you gave him and what you tried to take. But he doesn't hate you. Hate is easy. He's waiting to see if you'll choose differently. Henry's lips pressed tight. Sweat slicked his brow, though the night air had cooled. He lifted his hand but faltered, fingers trembling. Pride screamed at him to step back, to refuse this theater. Yet something deeper, older, kept him rooted. Grace extended her hand toward him, steady and sure. Let him choose. The world narrowed to the space between Henry's palm and the stallion's muzzle. For a breath, Midnight stood still, the air thick with memory and tension. Then slowly, the horse stepped forward. His warm breath brushed Henry's skin, and he touched the calloused hand with the softness of velvet. The crowd gasped again, but Henry heard nothing. His chest cracked open under the weight of the gesture. Tears, hot and unexpected, blurred his vision. Midnight's touch was not submission. It was acknowledgement. Equal to equal. Henry whispered, barely audible even to himself. I never gave him a reason to trust me. Grace's smile was soft, but unyielding. Now you can. The stallion lingered by Henry's hand, and for the first time, Henry didn't feel the urge to dominate, to conquer. He felt only the humbling grace of being accepted. The moment stretched long, quiet, undeniable. When he stepped back, his legs shook beneath him. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They stood in silence, witnessing something they could not fully name. Henry left the corral slowly, his head bowed, his heart a tangle of pride shattered, and something new being born in its place. That night, when the crowd dispersed into the dark and the torches burned low, Henry sat alone on his porch with a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He stared across the ranch at the silhouette of Midnight, grazing peacefully under the stars. The wager that had started as a boast now weighed on him like a curse. And yet, beneath the shame, a quiet voice whispered that maybe it could become something else, something better. Sleep would not come. The ranch breathed around Henry Walker, crickets sawing the dark, a coyote's far-off yip, the porch fan ticking like an old clock trying to remember time. He sat in the same chair where he'd watched thunderstorms muscle across the hills, where he'd kissed his wife goodnight 1,000 times. The glass, beside him, beaded with untouched sweat, catching starlight like a handful of tiny moons. Out past the yard, midnight grazed in a slow drift, a moving shadow stitched to the earth. The sight settled on Henry's chest with the weight of a memory he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He had been 9 the first time a horse pitched him into the dirt. The hill country then was rougher, the roads thinner, the men harder. His father, big-knuckled, sunburnt, a hat pulled so low you learned to read him by the set of his jaw, did not ask if Henry was hurt. He dragged the boy upright by the elbow and slapped dust from his shoulders with a quick, efficient hand. "You don't cry in front of an animal," he said, like reciting scripture, "else it owns you." So Henry learned. He learned the arithmetic of control, a sharp tug for hesitation, a heel for doubt, a tighter cinch for disobedience. He learned the value of efficient silence, of getting through a day without being seen. When his father died 2 summers later, the lessons remained, clean as a brand that never cooled. The ranch didn't ask for softness. It asked for proof. Each night, lying in a narrow bed, he promised the darkness he would be the kind of man who bent the world before it bent him. Years layered on years, calves tagged, fences mended, colts trained until their heads lowered at the slightest press of a finger. He married a woman whose laugh sounded like a creek spilling over stones, and for a while the house warmed. She taught him the grammar of mercy. A hand held a second longer, a voice lowered instead of raised. Then the winter cough took her in a spill of quiet weeks, and the rooms went back to echo. Henry did what men like him do. He worked. He tightened the cinch on everything, on his grief, on his son, on his land. The night smelled of cedar and old rain. He closed his eyes, and in the dark he heard another sound. Grace's harmonica, a ribbon of tone that seemed to mend the air as it moved. He had scoffed at it, the way he had taught himself to scoff at anything that reached for softness. Yet there it was, threading through him even now, turning rooms he'd locked from the inside. "He doesn't hate you," she'd said. "He's waiting to see if you'll choose differently." Choose differently. The words itched like a healing wound. He remembered Caleb as a boy, no taller than a fence plank, palm outstretched toward a skittish mare. "Let her sniff you first, Pa," the child had said, coaching the father. Henry had laughed, not unkindly, and taken the lead rope. He had told himself that firmness was a way of loving, that safety wore the face of control. But tonight, with the stars burning holes in the black and midnight raising his head at some secret of the grass, Henry felt the lie loosen in him, a boot finally pulled free of deep mud. The past came in flashes. The day he bought midnight at the sale barn, heavy with the smell of fear and rain. The stallion had stood apart, eyes like wells, the ringman's chant sliding around him as if language itself could not get a grip. Henry had felt something then, something like awe masquerading as challenge. He told himself a familiar story. If I can ride that, I am who I say I am. If I can't, maybe I never was. He set the glass down, and listened to the porch boards creak beneath his shifting weight. Pride showed him its ledger, trophies lined above the mantel, photos of horses slick with winning, men shaking his hand, the hard-won congratulations of neighbors who measured respect in nods. But below those lines, in smaller script, another accounting glimmered. Jessie flinching from Midnight's teeth, Ellen stepping away with her jaw set, Tommy curled around his ribs and trying to turn pain into a joke. Grace, standing in dust, singing the air open until a storm of a horse lay down his thunder. Henry rubbed at the heel of his hand, where earlier that evening Midnight's breath had warmed his skin. He'd braced for violence and received regard. The gentleness of it unnerved him more than any buck or rear. There are blows you can brace for. You cannot brace for being seen. A moth shouldered itself against the lantern glass. He watched its stubborn orbit and felt absurdly tender toward the little thing. "You'll burn yourself," he murmured, and only later heard the echo. How many times had he flung himself at a brightness that promised definition and delivered only scorch? The screen door creaked. Caleb stepped onto the porch, hair mussed, bare feet whispering the paint. He didn't sit right away, just leaned on the rail and looked out where the pasture worked its slow silver alchemy. "Can't sleep either," he said. "No." Henry cleared his throat. "Too much racket in my head." Caleb's voice gentled. "It's okay to let some of it out, Pa." Henry almost laughed. The boy, no longer a boy, had inherited his mother's quiet courage. "Do you remember the mare you named Hazel?" he asked. Caleb smiled. "She despised me until I learned to wait." "Waiting," Henry said, tasting the word like a foreign fruit. "I never knew how." They stood there a while, the silence companionable. Coyotes yipped again, farther off now. A night breeze shouldered across the porch, bringing with it the faint sweetness of hay. Henry found himself speaking before he decided to. "I thought control was how a man kept himself from disappearing," he said. "Turns out I disappeared into it." Caleb's hand closed around the rail, knuckles pale in the starlight. "You're here now." It was so simple, Henry nearly resisted it out of habit. He nodded instead, a gesture that felt like loosening a knot you'd carried so long it had become your posture. "Tomorrow," he said, surprising himself, "I want you by me in the corral. I want to learn what she's doing, not to beat it, just to understand." Caleb exhaled, a sound almost like relief. "We'll listen." We. The word found a soft seat in Henry. He pictured Grace's palm on Midnight's face, the stallion's eyes going soft like dusk. He imagined stepping into the pen without a plan to prove anything. It scared him, the way open ground does when you've spent years walking fence lines. It also felt like rain arriving after a long season of promising clouds. The porch fan ticked on, measuring minutes. The whiskey stayed in its glass. Henry had the ridiculous urge to apologize. To the horse, to his son, to the rooms of the house where his wife's laughter had pooled and faded. He did not know how to make it right. He knew only the shape of the first step. Less gripping. More listening. Out in the dark, Midnight lifted his head and turned it toward the house, ears pricked to some small sound. For a heartbeat, Henry felt the gaze like a hand on his shoulder. Steady, assessing, not unkind. He raised his own hand, palm open in the night, ridiculous and sincere. "Tomorrow," he said again, to Caleb, to the moth, to the horse, to the boy he had been, and the man he still hoped to be. Tomorrow, we do it another way. He stayed on the porch long after Caleb went in, letting the night unspool. The harmonica's ghost song drifted back to him, and he did something he had not done since he was a child, standing mottled with dust under a sky too big to own. He prayed, not for victory, not for reputation, but for gentleness to outlast the old habits when morning came. And when at last he rose, the chair giving up his weight with a wooden sigh, he felt the brand on his life cool a fraction. Not erased, nothing honest ever is, but no longer burning. Beneath it, skin he had not visited in years waited, tender and new. The wound was still a wound. It was also, perhaps, a door. The morning broke soft, with fog stretching like gauze over the pastures. Dew clung to the grass, and the first rays of sun painted the land in gold so fragile it seemed it might vanish if anyone spoke too loud. Henry Walker rose early, though his sleep had been shallow, and found Caleb already saddling a quiet bay gelding in the barn. They exchanged a glance, no words, and together they walked toward the corral where midnight waited. Grace was there ahead of them. She stood in the center of the pen, her boots dark with damp earth, harmonica in one hand and a curry brush in the other. Midnight circled lazily around her, not wild, not docile, but attentive, his ears flicking every time she moved. She turned when she heard Henry's steps, her green eyes calm, but edged with expectation. "You came," she said. Henry touched the brim of his hat. "You said there was more than one way. I reckon I need to see it." Grace studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you'll listen, not just watch." The sheriff had appeared too, leaning on the top rail with his usual skeptical ease. A few ranch hands lingered nearby, curiosity pulling them in. The corral had seen violence and spectacle these past days, but today its air felt different, charged not with challenge, but with the fragile hope of change. Grace set the brush down and raised her harmonica. She played a few soft notes, nothing showy, just a melody like a creek finding stones. Midnight slowed his circling, head lowering, body loosening into the sound. Grace spoke over the music, her voice steady. "Horses don't understand force the way we think. You can break their bodies, but not their spirit. To reach them, you match their rhythm. You breathe when they breathe. You move when they move. You make yourself worth trusting." Henry's mouth was dry. He had spent decades gripping reins tighter, driving harder, demanding obedience through pressure and pain. The simplicity of her words unsettled him more than any challenge. Caleb leaned forward on the fence, his eyes alight, as though hearing truths he had always suspected but never dared say aloud. Grace lowered the harmonica and began walking a wide arc. Midnight followed, not because he was led, but because she invited him. Every few steps, she stopped, waited, then moved again. The stallion mirrored her, circling closer each time until his shoulder nearly brushed hers. Grace turned to Henry. "Your turn." The corral fell quiet. Henry's boots dragged a little as he stepped inside. He felt the eyes of everyone on him, the sheriff, his son, the ranch hands, even Grace, though her gaze was not judgment, but insistence. Midnight stopped, nostrils flaring, ears tilted forward. Henry swallowed hard. He tried to remember every lesson his father had beaten into him. Stand tall, never yield, Make the animal bend first. But Grace's voice cut across his memory. Leave your intentions at the gate. He exhaled, slow and shaky, and began to walk. At first, Midnight kept his distance, circling warily. Henry resisted the urge to shorten the space, to force closeness. He kept his steps even, his breath steady. A minute passed, then 2. Gradually, impossibly, Midnight edged nearer, his circle shrinking until Henry could feel the warmth of his flank as he passed. The sheriff muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be." Grace smiled faintly. "You see? Trust is built in silence." Henry paused, heart hammering. He lifted his hand, not reaching, just offering the space. Midnight slowed, tossed his head once, then stepped close enough for his muzzle to hover inches from Henry's palm. The stallion's breath rushed hot and steady against his skin. Henry froze, remembering the sting of pride, the fear of failure, the years of control he had mistaken for strength. Then, with deliberate care, he let his hand remain open. Midnight touched it. Soft, brief, but real. The ranch hands gasped. Caleb grinned wide, pride flooding his features. Henry felt something break loose inside him. Not painful, not easy, but necessary. He lowered his hand slowly, blinking back a sting in his eyes. Grace stepped closer. "It isn't magic," she said. "It's respect. He doesn't give it easily, but when he does, it's worth more than winning any bet." Henry nodded once, words thick in his throat. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a man proving himself. He felt like a man being given another chance. The lesson ended quietly. Grace left the corral with Midnight following at her shoulder like a companion, not a captive. The crowd of onlookers dispersed in murmurs, each carrying away the memory of what they had witnessed. Henry stayed behind, staring at the tracks in the dust, his footsteps and Midnight's side by side. He realized he wanted more than to win wagers or breed champions. He wanted to learn the music Grace spoke of, the language that had turned a beast into a partner. The old pride still stirred, restless and stubborn, but for the first time, Henry felt its grip loosen. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling light over the ranch, he thought maybe, just maybe, he had finally begun to understand what it meant to choose differently. The days that followed were unlike anything the Walker Ranch had seen in decades. Where once the corrals had echoed with curses, shouts, and the sound of bodies hitting dust, now they hummed with patience. Grace's presence reshaped the rhythm of the place. Her harmonica became as much a tool as a rope or saddle, a thread of sound winding through the mornings as horses lifted their heads, ears flicking, and seemed to breathe easier. Henry watched it all with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant hope. He rose earlier than ever, drawn to the corral not by pride, but by curiosity. Caleb often joined him, the two working side by side as Grace demonstrated her quiet methods, standing still until a horse stepped forward, moving in circles until the animal mirrored the arc, waiting instead of demanding. It was a strange reversal for Henry, his son teaching him, not with words but with example, patience shining in his movements. Even the ranch hands felt the change. Ramon, the wiry foreman who had once mocked Grace's approach, found himself holding his breath as Midnight followed her with unhurried steps like a shadow. Tommy Hart, ribs still sore from his fall, refused to stay away. One morning he appeared at the corral, clutching a battered harmonica he'd traded for in town. His first notes were clumsy, squealing like a rusty gate, but the horses didn't spook. They turned their heads, curious. Tommy flushed red, but grinned. "Guess they don't mind bad music," he joked. Grace smiled and told him every tune mattered, no matter how rough. The community noticed, too. Word spread through the hill country that the Walker Ranch was changing. People who had once come for blood and spectacle now returned with quieter intentions. Parents brought children to watch, not to gamble, but to marvel. Neighbors who had shaken their heads at Henry's pride found themselves drawn back, curious about the woman who calmed the untamable. Slowly, the bleachers that had been built for wagers became benches where families sat with picnic baskets, watching Grace and Midnight move together like dancers on a dirt stage. Midnight himself became the emblem of the transformation. No longer did he lunge at the rails or fling himself against the boards. He moved with a confidence that was neither aggression nor submission, but something freer. He lingered near Henry now, close enough that the old rancher could reach out without fear. The stallion's dark eyes still carried storms, but they were storms Henry no longer felt the need to conquer. One afternoon, as the sun leaned west and painted the barns copper, Grace gathered the hands and riders around. She held no whip, no rope, only the harmonica resting in her palm. "You've all been taught that a horse must bend," she said. "But bending isn't the same as breaking. Respect given is respect returned. You don't force trust, you invite it." Her words hung in the air, heavy but hopeful. Henry shifted uneasily. He had preached the opposite his whole life. Yet, as he glanced at Caleb, at Tommy clutching his harmonica, at Midnight standing calm in the dust, he knew her truth was already rooting itself in his land. That night, the ranch felt alive in a way Henry had almost forgotten. The barns glowed warm with lanterns, laughter carried from bunkhouse to porch, and even the cattle lowed softly as if sharing in the change. Caleb played cards with the hands, while Grace sat nearby, tuning her harmonica. Henry, usually apart, found himself drawn into the circle. When Grace looked up, her eyes caught his with a question unspoken. "Will you keep choosing differently?" He didn't answer aloud, but he stayed. Later, as the stars kindled over the hills, Henry walked the pasture alone. Midnight lifted his head from the grass and approached, slow but deliberate. The stallion's muzzle brushed Henry's sleeve, and the man's throat tightened. No wager, no crowd, no pride. Just a horse, acknowledging him in the quiet. Henry laid a trembling hand on the black neck and whispered, "Maybe you're teaching me too." The old ranch was gone. In its place stood something fragile, but growing. A place where control gave way to connection, where music and patience held as much weight as spurs and saddles. And though Henry did not yet say it, in his heart he knew. The legacy he was building now was not the one he had imagined, but perhaps it was the one that would last. The day broke with a stillness so complete that the land itself seemed to wait. By noon, the Texas sky shifted, clouds rolling in with a weight that pressed down on the pastures. Horses grew restless, tails swishing, ears pricking at a charge in the air no human could miss. Grace noticed it first, her gaze scanning the horizon where a jagged seam of gray split the blue. "Storm's coming," she said quietly, and Henry Walker stood beside her at the fence, arms folded. "We've had storms before," he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. He knew this land, knew when it was about to bare its teeth. And he knew what it meant when the animals felt it first. By late afternoon, wind clawed across the fields, tearing dust into spirals. The sky bruised to a sickly green, thunder murmuring like some ancient warning. The ranch hands scrambled, securing tack, nailing shutters, and driving cattle toward shelter. In the corrals, the horses whirled in panic, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Midnight was the worst of them, striking at the rails, rearing high as if to challenge the storm itself. "Get him inside before he breaks the boards," Ramon shouted, but no one dared step into the pen. The memory of his violence was too fresh. Henry felt the pull of old instinct, force, rope, sheer will, but Grace caught his arm. "Not with fear," she said firmly. "If you meet fear with fear, he'll tear this place apart." Lightning cracked over the ridge, the sound splitting the sky. Midnight bolted across the corral, crashing against the fence so hard the boards shuddered. The crowd that had gathered to watch these new lessons shrieked, parents pulling children back. "Then what do you suggest?" Henry barked over the wind. Grace's voice was steady, though her braid whipped loose in the gale. "We go in." Together, Caleb was already climbing the rail before Henry could answer. "He'll kill himself out there if we don't." His eyes burned with the same determination that had once been his father's, but now bent in a different direction. Against every instinct, Henry followed. He swung over the fence into the pen, boots sinking into mud as the first rain burst from the sky. Grace landed beside him, soaked in an instant, her harmonica clutched in one hand. Midnight whirled to face them, ears flat, teeth bared, the storm's fury reflected in his own. Grace lifted the harmonica to her lips, her fingers slick with rain. The notes that spilled out were faint at first, drowned by the wind, but steady, an anchor in chaos. She circled slowly, drawing Midnight's eyes. Henry mirrored her movements, unsure, his breath ragged, but he kept pace. Caleb moved between them, his arms out, murmuring words Henry couldn't hear. For a terrible moment it seemed useless. Midnight struck the ground, hooves sending mud flying, his chest heaving. But then the music found him. The stallion's ears flicked, head lowering just a fraction. Grace's song rose louder, braver, threading through the storm. Caleb edged closer, his voice joining hers, steady and calm. Henry swallowed hard. His hands trembled, not from fear of the horse, but from fear of failing when it mattered most. He forced himself forward, step by slow step, until he stood within reach. Midnight's sides shuddered, muscles quivering. The stallion swung his head toward Henry, eyes wild. Henry raised his hand, open, unarmed. "Easy, boy," he said, his voice cracking in the rain. "Easy." Midnight froze. The storm raged around them, thunder splitting, lightning flashing. But inside that corral, a fragile stillness took root. The stallion stretched his neck, touched Henry's palm, and let out a long, broken sigh. The crowd on the other side of the rails gasped. Ramon crossed himself. Sheriff Cole muttered, "I'll be damned again." Together, Henry, Grace, and Caleb guided Midnight toward the shelter of the barn. The stallion resisted once, then followed, his body trembling, but his steps sure. The other horses quieted as they passed, as if calmed by his surrender. By the time they reached the open doors, rain poured in sheets, the storm howling in defeat against the walls of the ranch. Inside the barn, With lanterns flickering and water dripping from their clothes, the three stood together. Midnight pressed close to Henry, sides heaving but calmer now, his head lowered. Henry's chest tightened as he stroked the wet black neck. He felt the heat, the power, and the trust, forged not in victory, not in wagers, but in the crucible of fear met with gentleness. Grace wiped water from her brow. "Storms show us what's fragile," she said softly. "But they also show us what's worth holding on to." Henry nodded, his hand never leaving the stallion. Outside, thunder rolled away toward the horizon, leaving the land cleansed, raw, and changed. Inside, Henry realized the same was true of himself. The storm had scrubbed the hill country clean. By dawn, the air was sharp with the smell of wet cedar and earth, the grass sparkling with beads of rain that clung like soiled glass. For once, the ranch was quiet. No betting crowds, no restless buzz, only the low murmur of cattle and the steady drip from the barn roof. Henry Walker stood outside the corral, boots sunk in mud, watching midnight graze with an ease that seemed unthinkable only days ago. The stallion's coat gleamed, damp but peaceful, his head low, tail swishing lazily. Henry felt a strange weight lift from his chest. The wager had collapsed, not in humiliation, but in transformation. What had begun as a boast had become something else entirely, a revelation he could no longer deny. His pride, once a fortress, now felt more like a crumbling wall. He could see over it at last, and what he saw unsettled and steadied him all at once. Grace found him there, her braid loose, boots splattered, eyes as green as the washed pasture. She didn't speak right away. She simply stood with him, watching midnight. Finally, she said, "Storms don't just tear down. They clear the air. What you build now, that's the choice that matters." Henry swallowed hard. "All my life I thought control was strength. I forced it on horses, on land, even on my boy." His voice broke, surprising him. But it wasn't strength. It was fear dressed up in boots. Grace didn't answer. She let the silence carry the truth. It was Caleb who stepped forward then, a hand on his father's shoulder. "Pa, we can make this ranch different. Not a place for bets and broken bones, but for learning what you just started to understand." Henry's throat ached. He looked from his son to Grace, then back at midnight. The stallion lifted his head as if sensing his attention, ears flicked forward, and for the first time Henry didn't see a challenge. He saw a partner. By midday, word had spread that Henry was calling everyone together. Ranch hands, neighbors, even those who had once come only to gamble, gathered in front of the barn. The boards still bore scars from the storm, but lanterns glowed warmly inside, and the air was thick with expectation. Henry stepped up on an old feed crate, his hat in his hand, and faced them. "I made this ranch a stage for pride," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I turned a horse into a spectacle and forgot that he was more than a wager. I forgot that every creature, man or beast, deserves respect. That ends today." A murmur swept the crowd. Henry lifted his chin, meeting their eyes one by one. "From now on, Walker Ranch won't be known for gambling or breaking spirits. It'll be a place where folks come to learn a different way, a way that listens instead of forces, a way Grace Miller has shown us. The people shifted, surprised, some skeptical, Some moved. Sheriff Cole leaned against the rail, arms crossed, a slow smile breaking his face. Tommy Hart whooped, punching the air. Caleb stood tall, pride unhidden in his eyes. Grace stepped up beside Henry, her harmonica glinting in the sun. "It won't be easy," she said. "Patience never is. But every hand here can learn, and every horse here is waiting." For a moment, the ranch was silent, suspended on the edge of something new. Then Ramon, the foreman who had once scoffed at Grace, removed his hat and nodded. "Then let's get to work." One by one, the others followed, hats lifted, heads bowed. Henry felt his heart swell, not with the hard pride of old, but with something softer. Resolve. He glanced at Grace, and she gave the smallest smile, a promise in the curve of her lips. That evening, as the sun bled out across the hills in streaks of amber, Henry walked the pasture with Midnight at his side. No rope, no saddle, no force, just a man and a horse sharing the same ground. The stallion nudged him once, almost playfully, and Henry chuckled, the sound foreign to his own ears. "You win," he murmured, though he knew it wasn't about winning at all. Above them, the sky cleared, stars pricking the dark. Henry tipped his hat back and let himself breathe deeper than he had in years. The ranch had survived the storm. Now it would survive him, too. Not because he had conquered it, but because he had chosen to walk a different path. The summer night spread wide over the hill country, stars sharp as glass scattered across the velvet sky. Lanterns glowed on, the Walker porch, casting long shapes that swayed with the breeze. Inside, laughter spilled from the bunkhouse, where the hands lingered over coffee and cards. The storm had passed. The fences were mended, and the ranch seemed to breathe with a rhythm entirely new. Yet Henry Walker sat on the steps alone, his hat resting on his knee, turning the silence over in his hands like a coin. Midnight grazed in the pasture beyond, a black figure, haloed by moonlight. Grace stood beside him, one hand on the stallion's mane, the other holding her harmonica, as if considering whether to play. Caleb joined them after finishing the evening rounds, slipping easily into the quiet rhythm, his voice carrying low as he spoke to the horse, like an old friend. Henry watched them, his son and the stranger who had upended everything he thought he knew, and felt an ache that was not regret but something deeper. Recognition. He rose at last, his knees stiff, and walked across the damp grass toward them. The night air smelled of hay, horses, and fresh beginnings. Midnight lifted his head as Henry approached, but did not move away. Grace looked up, her green eyes reflecting starlight. Caleb stepped back a pace, leaving room. Henry laid a hand on the stallion's neck. Midnight's muscles shifted under his palm, alive and strong, yet calm. "You've been teaching me, haven't you?" Henry murmured. "All these years I thought I was the master. Turns out I was the student." Grace smiled faintly. "Horses have a way of showing us who we really are." Henry chuckled, the sound rough but free. "If that's true, then I reckon I've been a stubborn old fool." Caleb's voice softened. "Maybe. But you're a fool who changed." The three of them stood there together, the silence between them no longer heavy but full. Grace lifted her harmonica, and this time Henry didn't resist. The tune that drifted out was simple, a thread of melody that wove through the night like a blessing. Midnight lowered his head, eyes half closed, the sound smoothing the air around them. Henry felt his chest ease in a way he hadn't known it could. In the weeks that followed, the ranch reshaped itself. Word spread across counties. The Walker place was no longer a betting ground, but a school of patience. Families arrived to watch Grace teach. Ranchers sent their colts to learn under her quiet methods, and young men like Tommy Hart traded their bravado for harmonicas and notebooks. Caleb grew into his role beside her, showing others what trust looked like in practice. Even Sheriff Cole admitted, with a wry grin, that he'd been wrong to think Henry couldn't change. For Henry, each day was still a battle with the old pride. There were moments he wanted to snap, to grip tighter, to demand the world bend to him again. But then midnight would turn his head, meeting Henry's eyes with that steady, unflinching gaze, and the old man would remember. He would loosen his hand. He would wait. And every time he waited, something inside him healed. One evening, months after the storm, Henry sat with Grace on the porch while Caleb saddled horses for a ride. The sun was setting, painting the hills with fire. Henry lifted his glass of water. Whiskey had grown less tempting now, and said, "You know, when I made that bet, I thought I was building a legend. Turns out I was building a lesson." Grace clinked her glass softly against his. Legends fade. Lessons last. Henry looked out at the pasture, where Midnight trotted alongside the younger colts, powerful but at ease. "Then let this ranch be remembered not for the horse no one could ride," he said, "but for the man who finally learned how to listen." Grace's eyes softened, and she said nothing, because nothing more was needed. The harmonica rested in her lap, silent, yet the music lingered all the same. As darkness fell, Henry stood and joined Caleb and Grace for a slow ride across the land. Midnight carried Grace, his stride smooth and sure, while Henry's old gelding walked steady at his side. The three of them rode under the stars, the ranch stretching endless before them. And for the first time in a long life, Henry Walker felt free. Not because he had conquered, but because he had surrendered. Not to weakness, but to understanding. Not to loss, but to love. The bet was long forgotten. The legacy was rewritten, and in the hush of the Texas night, the Walker Ranch began again. And now, I want to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple comment. Type 0 if you believe in second chances, or 1 if you think trust can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more powerful stories like this one are on the way, and I promise each will move you even deeper.